user accounts. In this video, we're going to talk about user accounts, and of course, everyone that wants to access any part of your network is going to need to have one. Now, there are really two types of user accounts you can have, either a local account or an Active Directory domain account. So, what's the difference? Well, a local user account is local only to a specific machine, and it will only grant you access to resources on that machine alone. Whereas an Active Directory domain account is a central account stored on a domain controller that can let you access practically anything inside the domain with the right permissions and group memberships. Now, there's quite a few ways that you can create a user account. The most common is going to be using the server management console on a member server or Windows 2008 server that isn't part of a domain. Or we'll use the Active Directory Users and Computers console for domain accounts, so we're going to look at that, and in a later video we'll see how we can use the command line to create a whole lot of user accounts with some automated tools. Now, when you create Active Directory domain accounts, you'll also be governed by complexity requirements, and these are certain attributes that your password must contain, or it's going to be rejected by Windows 2008 for basically being a bad, easy to break password. So we're going to show you what those complexity requirements are, and it will help you force your users to create stronger passwords, so it's actually quite a good thing. We'll learn what a security identifier is and how we can find out what our own SID is for our user account. We'll also learn the reverse of this and see how we can find out which user account a SID belongs to, and it's useful to know this, especially later on when you start managing permissions on objects inside your domain. Then we're going to talk about delegation, where we can grant restricted permissions to other users in our domain to create user accounts for us if we're too lazy or too busy to do it ourselves. And this is pretty cool since it allows us to grant only the permission to create user accounts and nothing else. So the person you give this ability to can help out with the task of creating user accounts, and they can't go off and break other things. And finally, we'll look at how we can find out what permissions we have inside our domain using the Effective Permissions tool. And this is really useful to know, since if you've ever manually tried to figure out what permissions a person has to various objects in your domain, you'd know that it can be a frustrating experience, and this tool really helps make things easier. So let's get started. I've logged on to a Windows 2008 server here, which isn't part of a domain, and it's important to understand that to be able to create local accounts, the server cannot be a domain controller, but it can be a member server within a domain. So we'll go and click on Start, and we'll select Administrative Tools, and we can launch Computer Management Console from here, or we can come down to the bottom here in our Quick Launch area and click on the grey Server Manager icon. Either way, it's going to take us to the same place. So we'll come up here on the left-hand side and we'll expand Configuration. Then we'll expand Local Users and Groups. And we'll select the Users folder. And now we'll right-click in our Users folder, or we can right-click here in the middle of our window and choose New User. And then we'll need to enter in a name for this user. So let's call this user Bob. And the next field, we can also enter in a full name for Bob, so let's call Bob Jones. And then we can provide an optional description for Bob as well. Now next, we'll need to give Bob's new local user account a password, so we'll type one in here, and then we'll need to type it in twice just to confirm that we spelt it all correctly. And down the bottom here, the default is to force Bob to change his password when he first logs onto this computer, but if we uncheck this box, we could set Bob's account so that he can't change his password, or we can set it so that his password never expires. Now finally, we can also create his account but leave it in a disabled state if we're creating Bob's account ahead of time and he doesn't really need access to it yet, and that's a good security measure. Okay, so once you've filled in everything here, we'll click on the Create button, and then we'll click Close. And there we can see Bob's local user account is now ready to go. Now, I will point out that ordinarily you won't be creating local accounts like we've just shown. If you do need to grant users elevated permissions on a member server, you'd most likely create a local group on this server and then add a domain global group to it, which is the preferred method of assigning permissions to a local server like this one. However, if you do want to be able to log onto this server locally, you now know how to create a user account. So let's move on and we'll talk about how we can create Active Directory domain accounts. Now I've just switched over to my Windows 2008 domain controller here, so we'll go and click on Start, and we'll select Administrative Tools, and then we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Alright, now we'll expand our domain here on the left hand side, winstructorlab.com, and we'll select the users container. Now in a small company or even some large companies, the user accounts that you create will often all be created directly in this users container, and that probably sounds pretty logical, creating user accounts in a container called users. But you can create other folders if you like and create your user accounts there. That way you can structure your users folders so that they're more like your company departments or physical locations. So for example, we could right click on our domain here and we could choose to create a new organizational unit, and let's call this one Winstructor, and we'll click on OK, and now we'll right click on our Winstructor OU and we can create another OU, and we'll call this one New York, and let's create one more. We'll right click again, we'll choose new organizational unit, and we'll call this one London. Now that we've got a basic structure here, we could now have all of the users in your New York branch placed in the New York OU, and then all of the London users can go into the London OU for easier management. Now if you then had sales and marketing departments at each of those locations, you could even then create child OUs for those departments. Now in order for you to be able to create a new user account, you will need to be either a member of the Enterprise Admins Group or the Domain Admins Group, or you'll need to be a member of the Account Operators Group. And if you're not a member of any of those three groups, you must then have been delegated administrative permission to be able to create user accounts inside our containers, and we're going to talk more about delegation later on in this video. So if you happen to log on and you don't even see a menu option to create a new user account, then you probably don't have sufficient permissions to be able to create user accounts. Alright, so let's go and create a first user account. So we'll create this in our Winstructor OU here. So we're going to right click and we'll choose New User. Now the first thing we're going to have to do here is to give our new user a name. So in the first name field, we'll call this user Jane. And in the surname field, we'll give her a surname of Smith. And that's automatically going to populate the full name below here with the first name and the surname that we've just entered in these two fields here. But by the way, even though I have populated these fields here, the surname field is completely optional. But of course, it's a good management practice to fully complete these fields, since it's probably likely at some stage you're going to come across another Jane, and since you can't have two accounts with the same name, filling in everything is obviously highly recommended. Alright, now we'll need to give Jane a user logon name, which is also known as a user principal name. Although since you're going to hear the term user principal name being used so frequently, you should really become accustomed to calling it a user principal name or a UPN. So we're going to give Jane a UPN of J Smith, and this UPN here kind of looks like an email address with jsmith@winstructorlab.com. But for those of you that aren't familiar with UPNs, they have absolutely nothing to do with email. Although Jane could still have an email address of jsmith@winstructorlab.com. But whether she has this as her email address or something else, that has no bearing on what we're configuring here. This UPN is simply a logon name. That's all it is. It's not an email address, it's a logon name. So ordinarily, when you log onto a Windows machine, you have to enter in two or three things. Firstly, you're going to have to enter in a username, like JSmith, and of course, you're going to have to enter in a password. But if it's a domain that you're logging onto, you'll need to enter in the name of the domain as well. So a UPN allows you to enter in the username and the domain on a single line. So for Jane here to log onto this domain once we create her account, she can do so using JSmith and providing her password and domain, or she can enter in jsmith@winstructorlab.com. Both of those are going to work fine, and they function identically, so she can take her pick. So this UPN can be used to log on to any Windows system that's running Windows 2000 or higher, but the only real condition is that the name must be unique within your Active Directory forest. So what we're saying here is we won't be able to create two jsmith at winstructorlab.com accounts. Now, also do take note here that we can't change the suffix here, which is the last part of the UPN, and by default, that's the DNS name of this domain, but we're going to talk more about this later. Now, this pre-Windows 2000 logon name, by the way, is used for what's known as down-level clients, which includes things like Windows 95, Windows 98 ME, and NT, and it's automatically been populated for us once we filled in the UPN. So there's nothing we need to do here, but it's probably worth mentioning that also our pre-Windows 2000 logon name must be unique within our domain. Now we'll click Next, and we'll need to enter in a password for Jane's account. And in days gone by, many administrators would take the lazy way out here and simply enter in a password of password. Now, not only is that an easy password to guess, and I can tell you it's the first one I would try if I was trying to get into your account, but half the time the user just leaves it as it is, since it's pretty easy to remember. Now, thankfully, ever since Windows Server 2003 came out, Microsoft added in a security policy that enforced complexity requirements on user passwords. So the old favourite password of password doesn't work anymore. So let's go and take a look at the policies that are being enforced inside our domain, and we'll talk more about these complexity requirements in a moment. So we'll go and open up the Server Manager by clicking on the grey icon here next to our Start button. Now we'll expand Features, Group Policy Management, then we'll expand our forest, winstructorlab.com, and then we'll expand Domains, and then our domain, winstructorlab.com. And finally, since all password policies are defined at the domain level, we'll right-click here on our default domain policy, and we'll choose Edit. Now, under our computer configuration heading, we're going to expand Policies, then Windows Settings, then Security Settings, Account Policies, and then we'll select Password Policy. And over here in the right hand side of our console, you can see we have 6 policies that are active inside our domain, so let's take a closer look at each of them. Now first, up the top here we have Enforce Password History. Now this policy will keep a track of all of the passwords that a user has had in the past. Now you'll note here that it's currently set to 24, which means that once we create Jane's account, and we haven't forgotten about her, we'll create her account shortly, once Jane logs on and she changes her password to something else, let's say her password was the word basketball, then she will not be able to go back and reuse the same password she had before until she's cycled through 24 other different passwords. So she could theoretically change her password to basketball 2, and then basketball 3, and then 4, and so forth, until she's made it all the way to 24, and then she'll be able to go back and set her password to what it was originally. Now the next policy we have, Maximum Password Age, is the length of time that a user can have the same password before they'll be forced to change it. Now this defaults to 42 days, so Jane would be only able to use her favourite password of basketball for 42 days before she's forced to change it. Now the next policy here is the minimum password age of 1 day. What this policy does is force a user to keep their current password for 1 whole day. Now you might wonder, why force a user to keep a password? Well, the reason that we do this is to prevent Jane from simply changing her password continually until she's cycled through 24 of them, just so she can use her old password for another 42 days. And this used to happen a long time ago, but since Windows Server 2003 came out, this practice was stopped because forcing your users to change their passwords, whilst it might not make you popular, a regularly changing strong password is much better as far as security is concerned. Why? Because if your password never changes, it could be brute forced or dictionary attacked, and eventually it will be broken. Now if it changes regularly, most crackers won't have enough time to successfully crack the password before it's been changed again. So, if a user really wanted to reuse their old favourite password, then at best they can change their current password once a day to a new one, and then only after 24 days will they be back using their old password. And I can tell you, either the person doesn't have a life and they really should start doing some work, or they're going to eventually give up trying. Now, the next policy here is the minimum password length of 7 characters, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Any password that a user creates must have at least 7 characters in it, and that can include a mixture of uppercase and lowercase characters, as well as numbers and special characters as well. Now, it's the next policy here that gets a lot of people when they try and create passwords. Password must meet complexity requirements. So let's take a look at what this really means. In order for a password to be considered complex enough to be accepted by Windows Server 2008, it has to meet a strict set of conditions. Firstly, it cannot contain all or part of the user's account name, meaning our user of Jane Smith wouldn't be able to use the word Jane or Smith as part of her password. The password must also be a minimum of 6 characters in length, although if you recall, there is another policy that raises this bar even higher and sets the minimum password length to 7 characters. But the complexity requirements policy needs at least 6. And in case you're wondering, since both of these policies are active by default, you will need 7-character passwords unless you either change the minimum password length policy to 6 characters or disable that policy, neither of which I recommend doing, by the way. Just leave it as it is, accept the 7-character restriction, and you'll have better security. So what are you allowed then? Well, your password must contain any number of characters from 3 of the following 4 categories. It can contain any character from A to Z in uppercase, any character from A to Z in lowercase, it can contain any number from 0 through to 9, and it can contain special characters like the exclamation mark, the asterisk, percentage symbol, and other non-alphabetic characters like that. Now, it doesn't have to contain all of these things, but it must contain at least 1 character from 3 of these categories. So, that said, the old favourite password of password just won't cut it anymore. We'll need something stronger and harder to crack. Now, if you did happen to want a variant on the word password that'll meet this criteria, you could use something like this, since it does have an uppercase character, some lowercase characters, and it contains a special character. It's also 8 characters in length, so that'll work fine, although I still wouldn't recommend using this password, as it still is just a variant on the word password. So use your brain and come up with something better. So for Jane, her favourite password was basketball, and if she was a little bit creative, she could use something like this, as it still reads kind of like the word basketball, yet it contains an uppercase character, it's got 2 numbers, some lowercase characters, and 3 special characters, and as such it'd be pretty hard to crack. It's also 10 characters in length, and it's probably not that hard to remember it when you really think about it. Now, there's one final policy left to look at, so before we go and close our domain security policy, we'll take a quick look at it. Store passwords using reversible encryption. Now, as this sounds, enabling this policy will store passwords using encryption that's reversible. Storing passwords using reversible encryption is basically the same thing as storing them in plain text, which is rubbish as far as security is concerned. But if you have older applications that require knowledge of users' passwords for authentication purposes, you'll then need to enable this setting. And this policy will be required if you are using the Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol through remote access or Internet Authentication Services, or if you're using Digest Authentication in IIS. Now, the default setting here is disabled, so just leave it as it is unless you absolutely need to turn it on. But later in this video, you'll see how you can turn on this setting for an individual user account. So unless everyone in your domain needs access to this feature, then it would be better to only allow it for a specific user account. And again, we're going to see where we can do that a little later in this video. Okay, well, now we're back in our Active Directory users and computers since Jane has been waiting patiently for a user account to be created. So now that we fully understand the password requirements, let's type in a password for Jane's account. So we'll do that now, and we'll need to type it in again just to confirm it. Now, by default here, you'll notice that user must change password at next logon box is checked, and as obvious as this sounds, this means that the next time Jane logs on using her new account, she'll have to change her password to something different than the one we've just given her. Now, whilst you don't have to use this feature, it's recommended that you do use it, not only for security's sake, but it also shifts the responsibility for the account from us, the administrator, back to Jane. Now, it's not that we administrators want someone else to blame if Jane's account is compromised or if someone gets up to no good using her account, whether it's actually her or not. It's a good security practice that the only person that knows the password for Jane's account is Jane herself. Now, it's great being an administrator. We have the power to take ownership of Jane's files and reset her password if we need to, but we don't need to know what her password is. Because if something goes wrong on her account and you know the password, for example, let's say she's got some confidential information on her computer and suddenly she logs in and some of her files have been deleted or changed, the first person to get the blame is the other people that know her password, and that's you. So, for all people involved and to remain in line with best security practices, make sure that you leave this box checked. You don't need to know other people's passwords anyway. Now next we have user cannot change password setting, and for a normal user account, it's best to leave this one as it is. Changing the user password on a regular basis is a good security practice anyway, as we've already discussed. Now, the most likely reason that you'd use this feature would be for a service account, or perhaps an account that was shared amongst a few people, which is more likely in a home environment though and not a domain. Now the next option here is to set the password to never expire, and we won't select this for normal user accounts. And yeah, I know administrators love to be exempt from this rule. The guys with the most privileged accounts are often the ones to enable these features on their own accounts, and you know I'm right, don't you? But where this is useful is when you have service accounts that are used to run applications or scripts without user intervention. So let's say that you have a backup script that needs to run at scheduled intervals, and this script needs certain permissions to access the data that it needs to include in the backup. Well, if the password on that account was set to change every 42 days as set by our default domain policy, then every 42 days your script will suddenly stop working, at least until you set a new password and then update the script to use the new password. And of course, it's recommended that for these accounts that are used for services that you do set a really strong password, since they're often set and forgotten about. So if you're using non-expiring passwords, at least make it a good one. Lastly, we have the account is disabled field. Now in most cases, you'll be creating accounts for a person or a service to use immediately, so you won't likely use this option very often. But where it is useful is when you're creating accounts for people or services that won't be using it straight away. So let's say that Jane has just joined our company, but it's Friday today and she doesn't actually start work until Monday. We could do the work of creating her account now and then check this box to disable her account. That way it can't be compromised or used over the weekend, and then on Monday morning we only need to re-enable the account and then Jane can use it. Alright, well we'll click Next, and we'll get a brief summary telling us that when we click Finish, Jane's going to have a new user account. She'll be able to log on using the UPN of jsmith@winstructorlab.com, and when she does first log on, she will need to change her password to something else. Of course, this account here will also be disabled, and an administrator will need to enable it first before Jane can use it. So we'll click Finish, and Jane's account will be created, and there we can see it with this little downward arrow icon over it, which indicates that the account is disabled. So let's enable it, since time flies and it's now Monday morning. So to enable Jane's account, all we need to do is right click on Jane's user account and then choose Enable Account. And we'll get a confirmation message telling us that the object Jane Smith has been enabled, and you can now see that that little arrow icon has been removed from her account. So Jane's now free to log in using the password we supplied, and she'll be asked to change that password when she first logs on. Now, we're free to create as many user accounts as we like, with the only condition being that each account must have a unique name. And speaking of names, although you and I see Jane Smith here for this account, behind the scenes, Windows sees something different. So if we click on Start and open up a command prompt, and we'll type in who am I with a /user switch, you can see here that I'm currently logged on using the administrator account of the winstructorlab.com domain. But over here on the right, we can see this SID, or Security Identifier, which is a unique value, and this is what Windows Server uses to identify my account. Now, the first part of a SID, or the prefix if you like, is this value S1521, which will always be the same, and it's been around since Windows NT 4. Now, the next three sections of the number here are a unique value which should never be repeated anywhere else inside your domain, and this value is what identifies the domain or the local computer if your account isn't a domain account. Now, finally, the last value here is a unique relative identifier, or RID as it's known, and in my case this value of 500 identifies the administrator account, and any default account, or in other words, any accounts that are installed by default when you first install your Windows Server, will have a value here of less than 1000. Now, any new accounts that you create, such as Jane's account, will have a value of over 1000, which of course again should be a unique value. So this here identifies my account, this identifies the domain, and together this should all be something unique, certainly within your domain. But it's also unlikely that if someone else, somewhere else in the world, creates an identical domain name and user account, that they'll never come up with the same numbers. Now, if you do happen to come across a SID like this and you're wondering who it belongs to, you can find out through the registry. Now, if we go and click on Start, and we'll type in regedit and we'll hit Enter. Now, over on the left here, we'll expand HKey Local Machine, Software, Microsoft, and we'll scroll down and we'll expand Windows NT, Current Version, and we'll scroll down again. I'll just move this window over a bit so we can see things a bit easier, and we'll expand Profile List, and then we'll select our SID. Over here on the right, you can see that this SID belongs to the administrator account. Alright, well, let's close this now and we'll go back to Active Directory, Users and Computers, and now that Jane's account has been created, let's go and take a look at her account to see what other settings are available. So we'll right click on Jane's account and we'll select Properties, or you could double click Jane's account and it's going to do the same thing. Now, as you can see here, there's a lot of tabs here up the top, and we won't be looking at many of them now, since a lot of these we're going to cover in other videos, so we'll just stick to the ones that are relevant to our user logons. So on the first tab here, the General tab, this is where we can put in some contact type information about Jane. Now, obviously, her name's already filled in, but we can add in additional information such as a description for her account, what office she works in, her telephone number, her email address, and a web address if she has one. And of course, these fields here, they're all optional. You don't have to fill them in, but I will tell you now, later on, when it comes time to search through Active Directory for information about people, especially in a large company, you'll be smiling from ear to ear if you take the time and make it mandatory for your administrators to fill this in properly. Now, the next tab, the Address tab, is pretty obvious what this is for a physical address for Jane. The next tab, the Account tab, expands on the information we gave when we created Jane's account. You can see here her UPN at the top, a user principal name of jsmith@winstructorlab.com, as well as her pre-Windows 2000 name of jsmith, and she can log on to our domain using either of them. Now, next we have a Log On Hours button and a Log On To button. If we click the Log On Hours button, we can control what times Jane's allowed to log on to our domain, and the default here is that Jane can log on during any hour of the day or night, which is indicated here by all the blue colours, and there's a key here on the right that tells us that blue is when Jane is allowed to log on, and white is when she's not allowed to log on. So if in your company your security policy dictates that you can only log on during business hours, we could change this by first changing the whole area to denied, and then we could position our cursor, say, at Monday at 8 AM, and then dragging it right down to where Friday is, say, till 8 PM. And then we'll choose Log On Permitted, and that changes that whole area to blue. Now, when we click OK, from 8 AM to 8 PM Monday to Friday is when Jane will be allowed to log onto our domain, and any attempts to log on outside these times, well, she'll be denied access. Now this feature though does only work for domain accounts, so if Jane was to try and log on locally to a computer, she'll still be allowed to do that at any time. She's just restricted now when it comes time to log on to the domain. Now if we click on the Log On To button, we can restrict which computers Jane's able to log on to. Now the default here is to allow Jane to log on to all computers, so that's not going to restrict Jane's ability to log on to any particular machine. But where this feature is probably most useful would be when you have people that will only ever be needing access to a single machine or only a couple of machines. Such as if Jane here was a consultant and she's building a SQL Server database for us or something like that, or perhaps she's working on a specific project and she needs access to a specific computer. Now here we could select the following computers radio button and then enter in a name of a computer that Jane's able to log on to and click add, and we can add in as many or as few as we like. But be aware that if you do use this feature, then it will disable the ability for Jane to log into anything else other than the ones you specify in this list. Now, as with our log on hours feature, this feature only works for domain accounts, so again, if Jane was to try and log on locally to any computer that's not in the list, she'll still be allowed to do that, as this restriction is just for domain accounts. Now next we can unlock accounts that have been locked due to too many failed logon attempts. For security, Active Directory will lock an account, rendering it inactive, when someone attempts to log on with that account multiple times with the wrong password. Now if that happens, the account will be locked and an administrator will need to come in here and remove the check from this box before the user is able to log back in. Now next, under the account options heading, we've seen a few of these options before when we created Jane's account. The first three are the same. The user must change password at next logon, user cannot change password, and password never expires. Now if you recall with the next policy here, store passwords using reversible encryption, we saw that this was disabled in our domain security policy earlier in this video, and since this box is unchecked, it's also disabled here as well. But if Jane needed access to an old application that required access to her password, we could turn this feature on by checking the box here, and then it would only be enabled for Jane's account and would override the default domain policy for Jane only. Now, if we wanted to disable Jane's account, we could check the next box here and Jane won't be able to use her account until we remove the tick from the box, and that's a good security practice when perhaps you might know that Jane's going to be on vacation, for example, and she won't need access to her account for a certain period of time. Now we could also force Jane's account to require a smart card to log on. We could prevent her account from being able to be delegated, and we're going to talk more about delegation in a moment. And finally, the last few options that we've got here all relate to Kerberos, which is something that we're going to talk about in another video. Finally, at the bottom of this window here, we have the Account Expires section, which does default to never, but we can use this feature to set a user account to expire at a certain date. And that's really useful when you only need a temporary account, or you might know that you won't need this account after a certain time, such as, let's say Jane's a consultant working on one of our servers, and she's only here for a week. Well, we could set Jane's account to expire on a certain date, say a week in advance, and that gives us more security, especially if we have a bad memory and we're likely to forget to disable her account after she's left, or perhaps she's handed in her resignation and she's due to finish up in a week. Again, we could set this to a week later, and when it comes time for her to leave the company, her account will automatically be disabled to prevent her from logging in once she's left. So for situations like this, remember that this setting's here, as it can be very useful. Now the final two tabs that we'll look at here are the Telephones tab, where we can enter in Jane's contact numbers, her home phone number, pager, mobile, fax and IP phone. And finally, the Organisation tab is where we can enter in some more details about Jane's job description, the department that she works for, and which company. And whilst having a company field might seem pretty obvious, don't forget that in a lot of large companies, they'll have separate business units and spin-off companies, so this field here is actually quite useful. Now we could also link the account of Jane's manager as well, and if Jane has her own staff, they'll appear down the bottom here in the direct reports field. So let's go and define a boss for Jane. So we'll click on the change button, and let's say that the administrator is Jane's boss, because I don't have any other accounts created at this stage. So I'm going to type AD and we'll click check names, and then we'll click OK. And when we click apply down the bottom of the window here, this relationship here will be saved. So if we go and click on the properties button here in the middle of this window, this is going to open up the user account properties for the administrator account. So if we click on the organization tab, down the bottom here we can see that Jane Smith reports to the administrator. Okay, well, we've seen how to create user accounts using Active Directory, users and computers, so the next thing that we're going to cover in this video is delegation. Now, since our lives as administrators are normally very busy, there'll be a lot of times where you could use a hand to get things done. So let's take Jane here. Let's say that Jane has offered to help us out, so we've decided that we want to grant her the ability to create new user accounts to free up some time for us. Now, in years gone by, we could have just added Jane's user account to the administrators group, then she'd have all the permissions that she needs to create user accounts, but the obvious downside to this is that she now has the power to do just about anything in our domain, and that can be big trouble, as she could easily start destroying things either intentionally or by accident if she doesn't know what she's doing, and that's definitely something that we don't want to happen. Since Windows 2003, we've had the ability to delegate control to users to perform certain tasks. When we delegate control, we can be very specific about what permissions we want our user to have, so they won't get blanket permissions to our domain as they would get if they were an administrator. So they'll still have their regular low-powered user accounts, but with some very specific other permissions that we can control through delegation. Delegating control to Jane in this scenario is a great idea because it allows us to extend permissions to Jane to create user accounts or reset passwords or manage groups or perform some other task. The other really useful thing about delegation is we can also limit Jane's permissions only to a particular OU, or to allow her to do things across the entire domain. It's up to you, and you can control what you want to give Jane. So to configure delegation, we'll right-click where we want this permission to be granted. If it's over the entire domain, we'll right-click on our domain and choose Delegate Control. Or if it's just a specific OU, we'll right-click on an OU, and we can choose Delegate Control there. So let's use the New York OU in this example. So we'll right-click and choose Delegate Control, and this will start up the Delegate Control wizard. So we'll click Next. And then we'll be prompted to add in a user account or a group to whom we want to delegate control. So we'll click Add, and then we'll need to type in the name of the user or the group. So we can click on the Advanced button and then click Find Now. And we're going to list here of all the users and groups inside our domain. So we'll scroll down and we'll locate our user here, Jane Smith, and we'll click on OK, and then OK again. Now we can add in more users or groups if we like, but we'll just click Next. Okay, now we can choose what tasks we'd like to delegate control of to Jane. And you can see some very common tasks are listed here, such as creating, deleting and managing user accounts. We could reset passwords. We could create, delete and manage groups, modify the memberships of groups and so on. But we can also select a custom task to assign to Jane as well if we like. So let's select custom for the moment and we'll click Next. And up here you can see we have the ability to grant Jane control over the entire New York OU if we like, which pretty much allows her to do anything to objects inside our New York OU. And that's a bit too much power for what we need here, but this feature is really useful when you have an OU that you'd like someone else to manage. Now, considering our example though, where you might have an OU structure broken down by location as we do now with a New York OU and a London OU, now since I work at head office, I have control over the entire domain, which of course includes both of those organisational units. But I could use delegation to effectively grant any user administrative control over everything in our New York OU. But they won't have any permissions over the London OU though, since I haven't given them that permission. This here is concerned only with our New York OU. So this means that we configure delegation with this setting, Jane will be able to modify and delete and create pretty much anything she likes inside New York, but not the London OU. Now, if it's only management of a specific object that you want to delegate to Jane, we could choose the second radio button here, and then specify the object explicitly from the list below, and then we could choose to allow Jane to be able to create and or delete these objects. So you can take a look through this list here in your own time, and as you can see, it's a rather comprehensive list. There's a lot of objects in there to choose from. Alright, but let's click on the back button here. Since we don't really want to grant Jane access to the entire OU, she only needs to be able to work with other people's user accounts, so we're going to choose the top option here to delegate the following common tasks, and that will be to create, delete and manage user accounts. Now we'll click next, and we'll get a summary of what we're about to do here, which is to delegate control over user accounts to Jane, so we'll click finish. And now, just like us, Jane can also create user accounts, but unlike us, she can only work with user accounts, whereas us, the administrator, we can do anything we like, including revoking her access. Now that leads us to an interesting point. How do we revoke access to this OU? Or how do we even find out what permissions Jane has to this OU? Well, if we go and right-click on our New York OU and select Properties, we've got 3 tabs here, General, Manage By and Com Plus, and none of these tabs tells us anything about who has permissions. Now, if you've been around Windows computers for a while, you'll probably be looking for a security tab, and it doesn't exist. Well, that's not entirely true. It does exist, but it's laying in wait, hiding from us. So to coax it out of hiding, we'll cancel this for now. We'll come up here to the View menu, and we'll select to show the advanced features. Now we'll expand our Winstructor OU again, and we'll right-click on New York and select Properties. And now you can see we do have a security tab. And in here is our standard access control list we've all seen before, and there's Jane Smith, so we'll select her account, and in the permissions window below, let's take a look at what she has to our New York OU. Alright, well, she doesn't have full control, she can't read or write objects, or create objects or delete them, so what can she do? Well, if we scroll down to the bottom here, you can see that she does have the special permissions box checked, so to find out more, we'll need to click the Advanced button. So here we can now see that Jane has the ability to create and delete user objects, but only those objects that are inside our New York OU. And like I mentioned earlier in this video, members of the account operators group, they can create and delete user objects. The domain admins group, you can see here they have full control over this OU, so they can configure user accounts as well, and as well as anything else. And if we scroll down a bit, we can see the enterprise administrators group also have full control. So now that we know what permissions that Jane has to our New York OU, we could remove her permissions if we like, or we could click on the Edit button and then adjust her permissions accordingly. Now the truth is though, you can come in here and assign permissions directly. You don't need to use the delegation wizard at all. But it's much friendlier and it's an easier way of getting to this point, so it's recommended that you assign permissions using delegation. Now the final thing I want to talk about whilst we're here is on the Effective Permissions tab. This feature's great because it takes all of the guesswork out of determining who has what permissions to a resource, which, truth be told, can be a real pain to find out. So to find out what permissions a user or group has to this object, which is our New York OU in this case, we'll click on the Select button. And let's use Jane, so we'll type in Jane, we'll click Check Names, and then we'll click on OK. Now all the guesswork has been done for us, and we're presented with a list of what permissions Jane really has to our New York OU. And as you scroll down the list, you'll see a bunch of ticks indicating her permissions to this OU. Now if you haven't ever looked at Effective Permissions before, once you start using the Effective Permissions tab, you'll probably find yourself using it a lot. In this video, we've taken a long and detailed look at user accounts, both local users and Active Directory domain users. We saw how to create user accounts, and we've talked about how the password your users create will have to meet the complexity requirements and be at least 7 characters in length in order to be accepted. We also talked about how to identify what the security identifier, or SID, of a user account is, and also the reverse of that when you have a SID but you don't know what account it belongs to. And finally, we talked about delegating permission to other people so that they have the ability to access other resources inside the domain